The city of Los Angeles was vast and bright, a sprawling maze of concrete and lights that never seemed to sleep. But for Keanu Reeves, the night felt unusually quiet inside his own mind. He was sitting in the back seat of a car, watching the streetlights blur past the window, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. It was rare for him to go out to social events these days. He preferred the simplicity of his motorcycle rides or the quiet comfort of a book, but tonight was different. Tonight, there was a promise of something new. He was on his way to a private gathering at a modern downtown gallery. The invitation had come from a man named David, a producer who had recently entered the scene with a lot of buzz. David had reached out personally, claiming he had a script that was perfect for Keanu, something deep, character-driven, and away from the big action explosions he was known for. They had met for coffee once, and David seemed to understand the kind of stories Keanu wanted to tell. He felt a connection, or at least, he hoped he did. Trust was something Keanu gave carefully, like a precious gift, but once he gave it completely. The car pulled up to the venue. It wasn't an old building with heavy history. It was a sleek, modern structure with walls of glass that reflected the city's skyline. Keanu stepped out, adjusting his jacket. The air was cool and dry, with a faint breeze that rustled the leaves of the few trees planted along the sidewalk. There was no moisture in the air, just the crisp feeling of a night that was waiting to unfold. He walked toward the entrance. Instead of a grand, heavy barrier, the entryway was an open glass archway framed by steel. He stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. The space was filled with people dressed in expensive clothes, holding thin glasses of champagne. The room hummed with the sound of low chatter and soft laughter. Keanu took a deep breath. He hated these kinds of crowds, the feeling of being watched, but he reminded himself why he was here. He was here for the art. He was here for the possibility of a story that mattered. Almost immediately, David appeared from the crowd. He was smiling, looking perfectly at ease in his sharp suit. He reached out and shook Keanu's hand with a grip that was firm and warm. "Keanu, I am so glad you could make it," David said, his voice full of genuine warmth. "I was just telling some people about your idea for the ending of that second act." "It is brilliant." Keanu felt a wave of relief. It was nice to be talked to about work, about ideas, rather than just being a celebrity in the room. "Thanks, David. I've been thinking about it a lot. I wanted to talk to you more about it tonight." "Absolutely," David nodded, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the room away from the main bar. "Come, let's get you a drink. You look like you've had a long day." They walked through the room. Keanu nodded politely at a few people who recognized him, offering a small, shy smile. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He just wanted to blend in. They reached a high table near a large, abstract painting. David signaled a waiter, a young man with a blank expression who carried a silver tray with dark sodas and water. "Here," David said, handing Keanu a glass filled with dark liquid and ice. "It's just cola. I know you don't like to drink when you have to think." Keanu took the glass. The condensation on the outside felt cold against his palm. He trusted David. The man had been nothing but professional and kind. He raised the glass slightly in a toast to the possibility of new beginnings and took a large sip. The liquid was sweet and cold, sliding down his throat and quenching the dryness he felt from the drive. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. They talked about the script. They laughed about a misunderstanding they had had in their earlier emails. Keanu felt himself relaxing, his shoulders dropping as the anxiety of the crowd faded away. He felt engaged and alive. But then the room began to change. At first, Keanu thought it was just the lighting. The overhead lights seemed to pulse, rhythmically dimming and brightening. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. He looked at David, who was still talking, but his voice sounded strange. It was as if David were speaking from the end of a long tunnel, the words echoing and distorted, making them hard to understand. "The structure needs balance," Keanu tried to say, but his own tongue felt heavy and clumsy in his mouth. He put a hand on the table to steady himself, but the table felt slippery, as if it were moving beneath his fingers. A sudden wave of nausea hit him, violent and strong, rising from his stomach like a storm. His heart began to race, hammering against his ribs so hard he could hear it in his ears. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in his brain. He knew this feeling wasn't right. He hadn't drunk alcohol. He hadn't taken anything. This was wrong. David, he whispered, trying to focus on the man's face. I don't feel right. David stopped talking. He looked at Keanu, and for a split second, Keanu saw a change in the producer's eyes. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated look. It wasn't concern, it was something else. You look pale, Keanu, David said, his voice now crisp and clear, cutting through the haze in Keanu's mind. Maybe you had too much excitement. Let's get you some fresh air. Keanu wanted to argue, wanted to ask for help, to find a doctor, but his legs wouldn't listen to his brain. They felt like they were made of stone. He stumbled forward, and David was there, gripping his arm tightly. It wasn't a supportive grip. It was firm, controlling. David didn't lead him toward the main glass exit where the other guests were. Instead, he steered him toward the back of the gallery, past a curtain into a service corridor. The noise of the party faded away, replaced by the low hum of refrigerators and air conditioning units. Just lean on me, David said. Another man, someone Keanu hadn't seen before, stepped out from a side room. He was large and silent. Between the two of them, they guided Keanu through the corridor. Keanu's vision was swimming now. The walls were tilting. He felt incredibly small, helpless. He tried to remember where he was, tried to hold onto a thought, but everything was slipping away into a gray void. He felt like he was floating, untethered from reality. They reached a metal service gate at the back of the building. It wasn't a grand door, just a simple steel barrier designed for deliveries. With a loud click, the latch slid back. The cool night air rushed in to meet him, but it didn't feel refreshing anymore. It felt threatening. They pushed him through the gate. He stumbled, his knees hitting the hard pavement of the alleyway. Pain shot through his legs, but it felt distant, muffled. "Sit here for a minute," David's voice said, sounding detached and bored. "You'll be fine." Keanu tried to lift his head, to look up at the people he thought were his friends, but his neck was too weak. He slumped against the rough brick wall of the building. The texture scratched against his cheek. He heard the sound of shoes scuffing on the ground, retreating. Then the heavy metal gate clanged shut with a finality that echoed in the empty space. Silence followed. Keanu sat there alone in the dark alley. There was no one around. The sky above was a dark velvet purple, clear of any clouds or rain. The air was dry and still. He could see the distant glow of the city's streetlights at the end of the alley, but they were miles away, it seemed. He was trapped in the shadows, discarded like a piece of trash. He closed his eyes, fighting the darkness that was pulling him under, terrified of what would happen when he woke up, or if he would even wake up at all. The world had turned its back on him, and the silence was deafening. The sound of the metal gate slamming shut echoed in the narrow space, vibrating against the brick walls before fading into the heavy silence of the alley. Keanu sat slumped on the dusty pavement, his back resting against the rough, cold exterior of the building. For a long moment, he didn't move. His mind was trying to catch up with his body, but the disconnect was terrifying. He blinked his eyes open, but the world refused to focus. The streetlights at the far end of the alley looked like smeared streaks of yellow paint against a black canvas. The darkness felt heavy, pressing in on him from all sides. He tried to take a deep breath to calm the racing of his heart, but the air smelled of old garbage and exhaust fumes, making his stomach turn violently. He shifted his weight, intending to stand up, to march back to that glass entryway, and to demand an explanation. But when he tried to push off the ground, his arms gave way. It was as if the strength had been drained out of him, leaving him weak and helpless. He slid back down, his shoulder scraping against the brick. A sharp pain shot through his arm, but it felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Panic began to rise in his chest, cold and sharp. He was alone, completely alone. The realization hit him harder than the concrete floor. He thought about the people he had just left inside. David, with his friendly smile and promises of collaboration. Had it all been a lie? Had the entire evening been a setup just to get him to this point? The thought made him feel sick, a wave of nausea rolling over him that had nothing to do with the drug. He forced himself to stay still, closing his eyes for a second to stop the spinning. He needed to think. He needed to get help. Slowly, with shaking fingers, he patted his jacket pocket. His phone was there. A small spark of hope flared inside him. He pulled it out, the screen lighting up his face in the gloom. He tried to unlock it, but his fingers were clumsy and uncoordinated. He pressed the wrong numbers over and over again. The screen blurred in and out of focus. It felt like trying to thread a needle while wearing thick winter gloves. After what felt like an eternity of struggling, he managed to swipe the screen open. He squinted at the icons, but they were swimming. Who could he call? The police? His agent? A friend? The letters on the screen danced around, mocking him. He pressed a name, but he wasn't even sure if it was the right one. He held the phone to his ear, his heart pounding in his throat. Nothing happened, or maybe something happened, he couldn't tell. The voice on the other end sounded muffled, like it was coming from underwater. "Hello, Keanu," a distant voice asked. He opened his mouth to speak, to say that he was in trouble, that he needed help. I'm, he croaked, but his voice was barely a whisper. His throat felt dry and tight. The phone slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the pavement. He watched it slide a few inches away, but he didn't have the energy to reach for it. It lay there, the light slowly fading to black, leaving him in darkness once again. Time seemed to lose its meaning. Minutes could have passed, or maybe hours. The air grew colder as the night deepened. The city was still alive. He could hear the faint hum of traffic on the main streets, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of people living their lives. But here, in this narrow cut between the buildings, there was only silence and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He pulled his knees up to his chest, trying to preserve body heat. He wrapped his arms around his legs, hugging himself tight. The expensive fabric of his jacket offered little protection against the chill that seeped into his bones. The wind picked up, whistling through the alley, rustling a pile of old newspapers nearby. There was no moisture in the air, just a biting dryness that made his skin feel tight and his lips crack. He rested his forehead on his knees, surrendering to the dizziness. His mind drifted, strange and fragmented images flashing behind his eyelids. He thought about his motorcycle rides, the feeling of freedom and control he had on the open road. That felt like a lifetime ago. Now he had no control. He was at the mercy of whatever chemical was racing through his veins and the cruelty of strangers. A deep sense of shame washed over him. He felt stupid. He felt violated. He was a grown man, someone who had faced difficult times in his life, someone who considered himself strong. But tonight he felt small. He felt like a target. It didn't matter who he was or what he had accomplished. In this alley, he was just another human body, vulnerable and broken. He thought about the contrast between the world inside the gallery and the world out here. Inside, there was warmth, laughter, bright lights, and expensive drinks. Outside, there was dirt, cold, shadows, and abandonment. He had been stepped over, discarded as if he had no value. The memory of David's face as he pushed him out the door played over and over in his mind. It wasn't just indifference, it was a cold calculation. That was the hardest part to accept, the betrayal. As the night wore on, the nausea slowly began to recede, replaced by a heavy, aching exhaustion. His limbs felt heavy, like lead weights were attached to them. The worst of the dizziness had faded into a dull fog, but he was too weak to stand. He just needed to wait. He just needed to hold on until the sun came up. He looked up at the sliver of sky visible between the rooftops. The stars were obscured by the city's glow, but the darkness was beginning to soften. A faint gray light was starting to creep into the edges of the alley. It was the dawn of a new day, but Keanu had never felt less like celebrating. He just wanted to go home. He wanted to be anywhere but here. He shifted his position slightly, his muscles stiff from sitting on the hard ground. The trash near him rustled as a small animal scurried through it. He watched a rat dart across the alley and disappear into a hole in the wall. Even the rat had a place to go. Keanu felt a solitary tear track down his cheek, cooling his hot skin. He wiped it away quickly, angry at himself for crying. Crying wouldn't help. Crying was a sign of weakness, and right now, he needed every ounce of strength he had left. He thought about his sister, his friends. What would they think if they could see him now? He didn't care about the headlines or the scandal. He just didn't want the people who loved him to see him like this, broken, discarded, and alone. He promised himself that if he got out of this, if he survived this night, he would never take his safety for granted again. He would never trust so easily. The gray light grew stronger, outlining the shapes of the dumpsters and the crates stacked at the far end of the alley. The sounds of the city were changing. The night traffic was dying down, and the early morning sounds of delivery trucks and sweeping machines were beginning to filter in. The city was waking up. Keanu took a deep breath, testing his body. He still felt weak, his head throbbing with a dull ache, but the paralysis was gone. He gripped the edge of a metal crate next to him. He squeezed his eyes shut, gathering his willpower. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He pushed against the crate, straining his muscles. Slowly, shakily, he began to lift himself off the cold ground. He swayed, his balance uncertain, but he was upright. He leaned heavily against the brick, waiting for the world to stop spinning, looking toward the mouth of the alley where the morning light was growing brighter, signaling that his long night was finally coming to an end. The gray light of the morning slowly chased away the shadows in the alley, but it did little to warm the cold air. Keanu stood leaning against the brick wall, his legs trembling violently. It felt like he had run a marathon without any training. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. He was upright, but barely. He took a shallow breath, the dry air scratching at his throat, and looked toward the street. The alley mouth seemed miles away, a blurry rectangle of light between the tall buildings. He tried to take a step. His foot dragged on the pavement, making a scraping sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet morning. He stumbled, catching himself against a large metal dumpster. The impact sent a sharp jolt through his shoulder, but he didn't care. He just needed to keep moving. He felt a desperate need to get out of this confined space, to be where people were, even if he wasn't ready to face them yet. As he inched forward, the silence of the alley was broken. A low rumble grew louder, vibrating through the soles of his shoes. A garbage truck. It was the sound of the city waking up, the sound of work beginning. For most people, it was an annoying noise, a sign of early morning disturbance. But for Keanu, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It meant civilization. It meant help. He tried to wave his hand to signal the driver, but his arm was too heavy. The massive truck turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating the piles of cardboard and trash bags that lined the alley. It braked with a loud hiss of air, stopping just a few yards away from him. Keanu squeezed his eyes shut against the bright beams, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The truck's engine continued to roar, a beast idling while the workers prepared for their day. The driver's side door opened, and a man jumped down from the high cab. He was wearing a thick green vest, heavy boots, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't a movie star, he wasn't a bodyguard, he was just a man doing his job. The worker, whose name was Julio, walked toward the back of the truck, expecting another routine morning of lifting bins and hauling trash. He wasn't looking for people. He wasn't looking for trouble. But as he rounded the back of the truck, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, illuminated by the red brake lights, was a man slumped against a dumpster, looking like he had gone 10 rounds with a boxer and lost. Julio froze for a second. He had seen many things in the alleys of Los Angeles over the years. He had seen people sleeping in boxes, people arguing, and people too high to stand up. He usually kept his head down and did his work. It was safer that way, but something about this man made him pause. Maybe it was the expensive jacket, now covered in dust and dirt. Maybe it was the way the man was looking at him, not with aggression or madness, but with a quiet, desperate plea. Julio took a cautious step forward. "Hey, mister," he called out, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You can't be back here, it's not safe." Keanu tried to straighten up to show that he was okay, that he didn't belong in the trash. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. The world spun again and his knees buckled. He didn't fall to the ground this time because in a split second, Julio was there. The worker dropped the plastic bin he was holding and lunged forward, catching Keanu before he hit the pavement. He was strong, used to lifting heavy loads all day. He guided Keanu gently down to a sitting position on a crate, supporting his weight. "Whoa, easy there," Julio said, his tone changing instantly. He saw the pale face, the confusion in the eyes, and the sweat on the man's forehead despite the cold morning. This wasn't a drunk, this was someone in trouble. "Hey, look at me." "Can you hear me?" Keanu blinked, focusing on the stranger's face. He saw concern etched in the lines of Julio's skin. He saw kindness. For the first time in hours, the knot of fear in his chest loosened just a fraction. He nodded slightly. I was inside," Keanu whispered, his voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "They put me out." Julio frowned, glancing back at the high metal gate of the gallery they were behind. He put the pieces together quickly. This guy wasn't a homeless man who had wandered in. He had been thrown out. Anger flared in Giulio's chest, but he pushed it down. Right now, this man needed help, not a lecture. "Don't worry about that right now," Giulio said softly. He reached into his lunch bag, which was sitting on the truck's running board, and pulled out a bottle of cold water. "You look dehydrated. Here, drink this slowly." He unscrewed the cap and held the bottle to Keanu's lips. The water was the best thing Keanu had ever tasted. It was cool and clean, washing away the bitter taste of the drug and the fear. He drank greedily at first, but Giulio pulled it back gently. "Slow, slow," he cautioned. "You'll make yourself sick." Keanu took a breath and drank again, slower this time. As the water settled in his stomach, he felt a tiny spark of life return. He looked up at Giulio. "Why? Why are you helping me?" Giulio laughed softly, a dry, short sound. He screwed the cap back on the bottle and sat down on a crate next to Keanu, keeping a watchful eye on the alley entrance. "Because you're a human being, man. That's what we do. We help each other." It was such a simple thing to say. In a city of millions, where people walked past each other without looking, where connections were often fake and temporary, this stranger was offering him dignity without asking for anything in return. Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years making movies about heroes, about people saving the world. But here, in a dirty alley behind a building, the real hero was a sanitation worker in a green vest sharing his water. "Thank you," Keanu said, his voice stronger now. "Don't mention it," Giulio said, checking his watch. "We need to get you looked at, though. You don't look so good." He pulled a radio from his belt and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need an ambulance at my location, behind the gallery on 5th. Yeah, a medical emergency. No fire, just a guy who needs help." He clipped the radio back on and looked at Keanu. "They're coming, just sit tight with me." They sat there for a few minutes, the big truck idling beside them like a protective beast. The sun finally rose above the rooftops, casting a warm, golden glow into the alley. It hit Keanu's face, and he closed his eyes, letting the heat soak in. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't alone. Giulio didn't ask for his name. He didn't ask for a selfie. He just sat there, making sure Keanu didn't fall over, telling him about the truck route and how the morning coffee was always too hot at the diner. It was normal, boring conversation, but to Keanu, it was the most interesting thing in the world. It was the sound of real life. Soon, the wail of sirens approached, getting louder and louder. Giulio stood up and waved his arm to guide them in. The ambulance pulled up at the mouth of the alley, red lights flashing against the brick walls. Two paramedics jumped out with a stretcher and equipment bags. Giulio stood up and helped Keanu to his feet. "Here they come," he said. "You're going to be okay." As the paramedics took over, checking Keanu's vitals and asking him questions, Keanu kept his eyes on Giulio. He watched as the worker walked back to his truck, picked up his bin, and acted as if nothing special had happened. But to Keanu, everything had happened. Before they loaded him into the ambulance, Keanu called out, "Hey!" Giulio stopped and looked back. Keanu locked eyes with him. "I won't forget this." Giulio just nodded, a small, shy smile crossing his face. "Take care of yourself, friend." As the doors of the ambulance closed, shutting out the noise of the street, Keanu leaned back onto the gurney. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. The city had tried to chew him up and spit him out, but because of one good man, he was still here. He was still fighting. And as the ambulance drove away, he knew that no matter what happened next, he would find a way to pay that kindness forward. The inside of the ambulance smelled of strong antiseptic and clean plastic, a sharp contrast to the dirty smells of the alley. Keanu lay on the narrow stretcher, watching the paramedics work. They were efficient and kind, but he felt detached, as if he were watching a scene from a movie rather than living it. The sirens wailed, a piercing rhythm that matched the throbbing in his head, but underneath it all he felt a strange sense of peace. He was safe. He had been seen. He had been helped. When they arrived at the hospital, the doors slid open automatically, and he was wheeled into a busy, bright emergency room. Doctors and nurses in blue scrubs moved with purpose. They asked him questions, what his name was, what year it was, if he knew what he had taken. He answered them slowly, his voice rough. He told them he didn't know, that he had been given something against his will. They nodded and began to run tests. An IV was inserted into his arm, delivering fluids to wash the poison out of his system. As the hours passed, the fog in his brain began to lift. The sharp edges of the world came back into focus. The white walls of the hospital room stopped spinning. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He felt weak, like a newborn kitten, but he was stable. A doctor came in, a middle-aged man with a kind face and tired eyes. He explained that Keanu had been sedated with a strong drug, one that was dangerous if mixed with alcohol or left untreated. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. Lucky, Keanu repeated softly to himself. It didn't feel like luck, it felt like a miracle. A nurse handed him his personal belongings in a clear plastic bag. His phone was inside. He turned it on, and the device almost immediately exploded with notifications. Hundreds of messages. Missed calls, alerts. He stared at the screen for a moment before opening a news app. His heart sank. The headlines were splashed across the screen in big, bold letters. They weren't headlines of concern, they were headlines of judgment. Keanu Reeves found unconscious. Another Hollywood tragedy, nightmare at the gallery. The media had already spun the story. They didn't know about the drugging. They didn't know about the abandonment. They just saw a famous man who looked like he had fallen apart again. They were assuming the worst. They were tearing him apart without knowing the truth. He scrolled through the comments section of one article. It was a mistake. People were saying terrible things. He looks old and tired, probably back on the bad stuff. It's always sad when they crash and burn. The words stung. They were like little needles pricking his skin. He felt a flash of anger, hot and fierce. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell them about David, about the betrayal, about how he had just wanted to work and make art. He wanted to defend himself. But then he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He saw an image in his mind, a green vest, rough hands, and a plastic bottle of water. He remembered the stranger in the alley, Julio. The world on the internet was cruel, anonymous, and quick to judge. But the real world, the world where people actually lived and breathed, had shown him kindness. The stranger didn't ask for a headline. He just asked if Keanu was okay. Keanu stood up slowly. He dressed in the clothes they had given him, simple sweatpants and a t-shirt they found in a lost and found bin, as his own clothes had been taken as evidence. He told the nurse he was leaving. She advised him to stay to rest, but he shook his head. He had something he needed to do. He walked out of the hospital room, his footsteps soft in the hallway. He didn't take the private exit where the limousines usually waited. He walked out the main sliding doors into the sunlight. A few photographers were lurking by the curb, their cameras raised. They shouted questions at him, shoving microphones toward his face. Keanu, is it true you overdosed? Are you going to rehab? Who gave you the drugs? Keanu looked at them. He didn't shout. He didn't cover his face. He just looked at them with a calm, sad expression. He didn't say a word. He walked past them, ignoring the flashing lights, and climbed into the backseat of a simple taxi that had been called for him. He gave the driver an address, the alley. The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror, surprised. You sure, boss? That's a rough spot. I'm sure, Keanu said quietly. The drive back was short. When they arrived, the street was busy with the midday flow of the city. The alley looked different in the daylight. It was just a gap between buildings, mundane and ordinary. There was no one there at first. Keanu got out of the cab and stood on the sidewalk. He felt a moment of panic. What if he was gone? What if he never found him? Then he heard the sound of a heavy engine. Around the corner came the green garbage truck finishing its route. Keanu's heart lifted. The truck pulled over and the driver's door opened. Julio jumped down, looking tired. He pulled off his heavy gloves and wiped sweat from his forehead. He stopped when he saw Keanu standing there, clean clothes but still looking pale. Julio looked around, confused, as if checking if there was a camera crew filming a prank. You? He asked. Me, Keanu said. He walked up to the worker. He didn't care about the people walking by on the sidewalk staring. He reached out and took Julio's hand, shaking it firmly. I came back to find you. You didn't have to do that, Julio said, looking a little uncomfortable. I was just doing my job. No, Keanu said, his voice serious. You saved me. You didn't have to stop, you didn't have to care, but you did, and I will never forget that. Julio shrugged, a small smile on his face. It's a crazy world, man. People forget to be human sometimes. Keanu reached into his pocket. He pulled out a check he had written earlier at the hospital while his hand was still shaking. He folded it and pressed it into Julio's hand. "Please, take this, for your family, for your kindness. It's not enough to thank you, but please take it." Julio looked at the paper, then back at Keanu. He didn't look at the amount, he just saw the gesture. He nodded slowly, pocketing the check. "Thank you, you take care of yourself, okay? Don't let the city eat you up." "I won't," Keanu promised. Just then, a reporter from a local TV station who had followed the taxi rushed up with a cameraman. She pointed the microphone at Keanu, breathless. "Mr. Reeves, we saw you leave the hospital. Are you going to comment on the rumors about your drug use? Are you pressing charges against the people who left you here?" The camera light turned on. It was the moment the world was waiting for. The angry star, the scandalous rant, the blame game. Keanu looked at the camera, then he looked past it, thinking of the alley, the cold ground, and the hand that pulled him up. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I wasn't using drugs," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I was the victim of a crime, but that's not the important part. The important part is that there are good people in this city. I met a man today who reminded me what kindness looks like. I'm just grateful to be alive, and I'm grateful that good people still exist. That's the only story I care about." The reporter blinked, stunned. She lowered her microphone slightly. She had expected a scandal, but she had been given a lesson in humanity instead. Keanu turned back to Julio. "Can I give you a ride somewhere?" Julio laughed. "I got the truck, man." "Right," Keanu smiled. "Of course." He watched as Julio climbed back into his truck and drove away. Keanu stood alone on the sidewalk for a moment, the sun on his face. The darkness of the night was over. The cruelty of the betrayal didn't matter anymore. He had been shown the light, and he was going to walk toward it. He hailed a taxi, got in, and simply said, "Home." The days that followed the incident were strange for Keanu. The video clip of him standing on the street, thanking the sanitation worker and refusing to spread hate, had traveled across the world. It was played on televisions in Tokyo, shared on phones in London, and discussed in cafes in New York. The narrative had shifted completely. The tabloids that had screamed about his downfall just 48 hours earlier were now writing about his grace. People were shocked. In a world where celebrities often used their pain to get attention or to destroy their enemies, Keanu had done the opposite. He had refused to be a victim. He had refused to be angry. This quiet strength was more powerful than any shout. Inside the police station, things were much quieter. Keanu sat in a plain room with a detective. There was no crowd, no cameras, just a metal table and a cup of bad coffee. He had come here to give his statement, to identify the men who had hurt him. The detective asked him if he wanted to press charges, if he wanted to make a public example of them. "Yes, I want the law to do its job," Keanu said calmly, "but I don't want to be part of the show. I don't want to talk about them in the press. I just want it to be over." The detective nodded, closing his notebook. He seemed surprised by Keanu's attitude. Most people in his position wanted revenge. They wanted the world to know how they had been wronged. But Keanu understood that anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. He wasn't going to let David or the others live rent-free in his head. They had taken his night, but he wasn't going to let them take his future. When he left the station through the automatic glass doors, the sun was shining brightly. He took a deep breath. The air smelled of hot pavement and car exhaust, but to him, it smelled like freedom. A few weeks later, Keanu decided it was time to reclaim his life. He walked into his garage, a space filled with tools and machines. In the center sat his motorcycle. It was a beautiful machine, sleek and powerful. For a while, he had hesitated to ride it. The memory of being dizzy and out of control had made him nervous. But looking at it now, he knew he couldn't live in fear. He pulled on his leather jacket and helmet. He swung his leg over the seat and kick-started the engine. The roar of the bike filled the garage, vibrating in his chest. It was a sound of power, a sound of life. He rode out of the garage, turning onto the open road. As he picked up speed, the wind rushed past him. It wasn't raining. The sky was a clear, endless blue. The buildings blurred as he rode. He leaned into the turns, feeling the balance of the machine beneath him. For the first time since the party, he felt entirely like himself. He wasn't the sad actor or the victim. He was just a guy on a bike, moving forward. The anxiety that had gripped his heart since that night blew away in the wind, left far behind him. But Keanu didn't just move on for himself. He remembered the cold feeling of the alley, the helplessness, and the fear of being unseen. He knew that there were thousands of people in the city who felt that way every single night, not because they were drugged, but because life had been hard on them. One afternoon, he visited a large shelter downtown. He didn't announce his visit with a press release. He didn't bring a camera crew. He walked in with his assistant carrying boxes. Inside the boxes were warm jackets, new socks, and basic supplies that the shelter desperately needed. He also handed the director a check for a large sum of money, enough to keep the shelter running for the rest of the year. "Please," Keanu said to the director, a kind woman with tired eyes, "don't make a big deal out of this. I just want to help." The director was touched. She watched as he didn't just leave the boxes and walk away. Instead, Keanu sat down at a long table in the dining hall. He began to talk to the people eating there. He listened to a man talk about how hard it was to find a job. He laughed with a woman who told him stories about her grandchildren. He looked them in the eye. He treated them with the same respect and dignity that Julio had shown him. He saw them. He really saw them. This was the shock that kept on giving. The world was used to charity events where rich people wore expensive clothes and posed for photos. But this was different. This was real. Keanu understood that money was just paper, but kindness was the true currency of life. He had been saved by kindness, and now he was spreading it. The man who had drugged him, David, was eventually arrested. The security cameras from the back of the venue had caught everything. The justice system worked slowly but surely. When the news broke that David was facing charges, there was no gloating from Keanu. He didn't tweet about it. He didn't release a statement saying, "I told you so." He simply went for a hike in the hills, enjoying the quiet nature and the company of his dog. He realized that the event had not been a tragedy, but a lesson. It had stripped away the fake layers of the Hollywood world he lived in. It had shown him that the fancy parties and the fake smiles were meaningless compared to the honesty of a man sharing water in an alley. It had taught him that he was strong, not because he could fight, but because he could forgive. On a Friday evening, about a month after the incident, Keanu walked into a small diner near his home. The bell above the door jingled. He took a seat at the counter. The waitress, an older woman who had worked there for years, poured him a cup of coffee without asking. "Rough week?" she asked, wiping the counter. "Actually," Keanu smiled, taking a sip of the hot coffee, "it's been a pretty good week." He looked out the window at the street. People were walking by, heading home, heading to dinner, living their lives. The city was beautiful and messy and complicated. He was a part of it. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't afraid of the shadows. He knew now that no matter how dark the night got, there was always a morning coming. And if he ever fell again, he knew there would be someone there to help him up. He left a generous tip on the table and walked out the glass door, stepping into the warm, dry evening air. He hailed a cab, got in, and smiled as the car merged into the flow of traffic. He was just Keanu, a man moving forward, ready for whatever came next.